Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
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 Okay, so today we're going to meet for about an hour and then we're going to take a break and then we'll talk about the midterm exam that's coming up next week. So today we're going to talk about Central Park. And this week's lecture really closely follows the reading that you're doing, Creating Central Park, for this week. All the lectures are tied in with the reading, but this one very closely follows the reading. So the bigger issue here with Central Park is a need for public space. And we've been looking at historical maps of the city, and in the 17th century when New York was New Amsterdam and it was only at the southern tip of the island, the need for public space wasn't as great because they had all of the land to the north of the colony. And within the actual colony itself, the only thing that probably could have passed for public space here in the Costello plan is the old cattle market in front of the fort that a little bit later became Bowling Green, which was kind of the first green space devoted to recreation and games and stuff like that. And then as the city was growing, this is the city directory plan, 1789. Public space still wasn't such a big issue because again, there was so much farmland to the north of town. And at this point, the public spaces in the city would have been the Battery down here, which was like a public promenade, and Bowling Green right here, which by that time was a public park, and then the Commons here, which became, does anybody remember what park that became?
Wasn't it City Hall Park or?
Yes, it was, definitely. But then there was all the farmland north of town, so that was pretty adequate for a town of that size. But then we saw by the early 19th century, with the adoption of the Commissioner's Plan, that this is how they viewed the future of Manhattan. And they were criticized for not including enough public space. And this entire central part of the island, from here all the way down, from 110th all the way down to, whoops, down to 59th. All of this space here later became Central Park, but the commissioners, you can see they just wanted to map more streets and avenues through it. So they did provide spaces. Here's Observatory Place, Manhattan Square, which actually was built. Hamilton Square was not built, and others. So they did provide space, but for the predicted size of the city, they were criticized for not including enough public space. Their big gesture in this direction was the parade, or the Grand Parade, which you've already read about in your reading. But this was a proposed public space by the commissioners that would have extended from 23rd Street all the way up to 34th Street. And this was intended not as a public park in the modern sense. We think of public parks as a place to go to kind of get away, to relax. It has things like views and benches and places to play games and sports and things like that. It wasn't intended for that. It was intended as a place for the local companies of the New York State Militia to march and practice. And so it was a marshalling ground for the military. That was its intended purpose, but it was never built. It was such a big area, it was gradually whittled down. And eventually Madison Square was built, but way smaller. Madison Square is something like this in shape. So you can see the parade would have been much, much bigger, but only the tiny little portion there was later opened as Madison Square. So the parade was the commissioner's big gesture, and that never happened. So by the 1830s, the Common Council and others were becoming agitated again over the city's reputation. They were constantly comparing the city to other American cities. And so this is a quote from the Common Council where they say that it's worthy of remark that every stranger, meaning like every visitor to the city, whether from other states or from Europe, speaks about the paucity, meaning like the scarcity or the insufficiency of our public squares, and that in proportion to its size, New York contains a smaller number of public spaces than any other town of importance. And that was true by the 1830s. The city was, we saw with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1827 and the ascendancy of the cotton industry and other industries, New York was growing and was clearly the commercial center, commercial and cultural capital of America by this point, but had relatively few parks. So in the 1830s, they really remedied this. The city opens Union Square, slightly to the north of the Union Place that the commissioners talked about, that John Randall talked about. So Union Square was actually a square or a rectangle between 14th and 17th. And so that opens in 1831. And the same year, Gramercy Park opens just to the east of Union Square. And Gramercy was not actually a public park. It was a development by a lawyer and real estate developer named Samuel Ruggles. And I think he's mentioned in this Creating Central Park reading. And so Gramercy Park continues today as a private park. It has a fence around it. And to get access, you have to have a key. So keys are usually given only to the people who live right around the perimeter of the park. So to this day, it's not a public park, it's private. And in fact, I've never been inside of it because I don't have a key. And then Tompkins Square on the Lower East Side came about 2 years later, Stuyvesant Square 3 years after that, and then Madison Square finally in 1837, although it wasn't actually finished and open for 10 years after that. So the 1830s saw this initiative to try to add more public parks. But they were very small. And here you can see in a map from 1850, the shaded areas are the developed part of the city, gradually consuming the island, traveling up and down these commissioners' avenues. And then in the green, you can see the public spaces. And the point of this map was to show how inadequate this is. So you have the Battery down here, you have City Hall Park, St. John's Park here, which sadly isn't there anymore, Washington Square Park here, Tompkins Square over here, Union Square, which by the 1850s was the main gathering place in the city. That was the kind of center of the action. Stuyvesant Square over here, Little Gramercy Park right here. It's very tiny. Madison Square and Reservoir Square, which is today's Bryant Park, but it was called Reservoir Square because it was right next to the Croton Aqueduct Reservoir, distributing reservoir right there. But aside from those parks, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, there was Columbia College campus over here. There was the New York Hospital grounds here, but those aren't exactly public parks. I mean, semi-public at best. Astor Place, but that certainly wasn't a park. So not really adequate. And by then, this is, I think, 1848. The city is really getting pretty big and it's really dense. I mean, buildings are getting getting taller. I mean, you can see the Barnum's Museum over here is 5 stories, which at the time was pretty tall. And the streets are gradually getting filled in, so it's becoming a much more dense place. So there was a kind of a groundswell of opinion in the city at this time that the city needs a big park that's going to be adequate enough to accommodate the growing population. So William Cullen Bryant was a romantic poet. He was, I believe, trained as a lawyer. He was from Massachusetts, but he comes to New York and he takes over the Evening Post as its editor. And so he uses his position as the editor to start writing editorials in the Post, urging the legislature to step in, as they had so many times in the past, and fix a city problem. And he publishes an editorial in 1844 called A New Park, where he lays out his ideas for this new project. And the other important person who was advocating for a park was Andrew Jackson Downing. He was a landscape architect. And he also, and was an architect too. He also designed a lot of houses, like country houses. And he wrote books, and these books were really influential. The treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening is one of the main kind of foundational books for the landscape architecture gardening movement of the 19th century, cottage residence. And then he also was a farmer and a horticulturalist, so he wrote about fruit and fruit trees, and he wrote a book called The Architecture of Country Houses. So he was kind of a jack of all trades. And so he starts advocating for a park as well, and a park that's big enough to accommodate the growing population. So it comes down to 2 eligible sites in Manhattan. With the city growing as quickly as it did, there were fewer and fewer sites available that could accommodate the numbers of people that they were looking for in this new park. And there were very few pieces of land available, and there was an urgency that before the commissioner's plan is completely full of buildings, the legislature needed to go in and acquire a piece of land while they still could. So this is explained in the reading, but there were 2 sites that kind of were the finalists, which were the Common Lands and Jones's Woods. So Jones's Woods was a piece of private land along the East River. You can see it here in this map. It was owned by the Jones estate. They were a wealthy old family with roots going back to New Amsterdam. They were related to the Skimmerhorn family, another old, very wealthy New York family. The Joneses were also related to this is way too much information, but they were related to the Rensselaers. So one of the main wealthy landowning families in New York. And so it was owned by the estate And so the city was going to acquire that. And the thought was that would be a great place because it was really big. It was still relatively wooded. There was still, it hadn't been completely denuded of trees. It had some nice hills and lovely terrain, and it would have caught the breezes off the river. Would have been a really nice place for a park. But they had trouble acquiring it, and they go into this in the reading, but it was proving difficult legally to try to buy the land. In the middle of the island, right over in this part, this was the common lands that you'll recall from the remarks of the commissioner's introduction. That author talked about the common lands as being the precedent for laying out the commissioner's plan. And it had the receiving reservoir of the Croton Aqueduct right in the middle of it. It was relatively vacant still. So that was the other site. They thought, well, we can probably still acquire that. So this shows both of the proposed sites. Here's Jones Park over here, and then the common land site here. Here's the reservoir, the existing reservoir, and they had this idea that they're going to build a new improved reservoir somewhere up here, which they, of course, eventually did, and it now dominates the northern part of Central Park. So each site had its advocates, and they were promoting one site or the other. Bryant, the poet and publisher that I just mentioned, was really enamored of Jones's Park. He said, no finer situation for the public garden of a great city exists than Jones's woods. And then Andrew Jackson Downey was a big proponent of the common lands. So this is a map of the common lands. You can see it's kind of a knife-shaped piece of land that had been subdivided and sold at auction in the 1780s and 90s. You'll recall from the reading that you did on that. And it had several north-south avenues going through it already, including the so-called Middle Road, which is right here, which was digested into the commissioner's plan as Fifth Avenue, and then also Sixth Avenue here and Fourth Avenue. And then it had been divided east to west into this kind of grid of parcels of land, but some of them had sold, but a lot of them hadn't. So it was still pretty vacant at that point. So it was available. Downing really liked the idea of the common lands because it was so much bigger than Jones's Woods or Jones's Park. And here he talks about the idea. This is an idea that was really prevalent. Well, it's still really prevalent, but something that came into fashion in the late 18th century, early 19th century, which is this idea of rus in urbe, which is Latin from the country and the city. So this idea that public space in the city can be something where people can go and feel like they've left the city, so that they feel like they're in the country, even though they're not really. And this was a really democratic idea that people who couldn't afford to go up to Saratoga or the White Mountains or out to Long Island or wherever people vacationed in those days, people who didn't have a house in the country could still get away from the city, or at least feel like they've gotten away. It's all about creating an illusion, right? That it's not actually a rural landscape anymore if it's surrounded by the city. But there's an idea among landscape architects that started around this time that you could design it in a way that the illusion was convincing enough that someone going there for an afternoon would feel restored, almost like they had left the city. And so when Downing was pushing for the common lands as the site for the park, he talks about it in those terms, that it would be a place to get away. He says, in such a park, the citizens who would take excursions in carriages or on horseback could have the substantial delights of country roads and country scenery and forget for a time the rattle of the pavements and the glare of brick walls. So he wrote that in 1851. And that is what Central Park ended up being, right? I mean, it's big enough that if you go there, you can kind of get lost and you can sit on a bench and look at a lake, or you can go for a hike. There's hills and hiking trails, and you can kind of leave the city behind for a while. So it's kind of like this ideal of the urban park. So that's what he had in mind. So he was pushing for the common lands over Jones's Woods. So in 1850, Downing goes to England and he meets a British architect there named Calvert Vaux. His last name is pronounced Vox, like rhymes with fox or box. He convinces Vaux to go back with him and to become his design partner and his firm, which was in Newburgh, New York, outside of the city. And so Vaux was an architect, and so he comes back with Downing, starts working with him, mostly designing houses. And then 1852, 2 years later, Downing is killed in a steamboat accident on the Hudson River at the age of 36. So Downing almost certainly would have ended up being the architect of Central Park had he not been killed in this tragic accident. So this is a detail from, I think I showed you this last week when we looked at the Croton Aqueduct. This is a bird's eye view from 1854 showing what the middle part of the island looked like. And this is the site for the eventual site for Central Park, or something like that. With right here, you can see the reservoir right in the middle of it. But the other thing that you can get out of this, most of these images I'm showing today are all in the reading. But the other thing you can see is that the city is gradually advancing. Here's a line of houses along this avenue. Likewise here, this is the so-called Ladding Observatory, which this big tower that had been built right next to the Crystal Palace, which is like right about here. This is 42nd Street is like right there. So you can see that the city is pretty developed up to 42nd Street. And then north of there, there's so much vacant land. And it really is still the countryside north of about 42nd Street. The New York and Harlem Railroad is going up 4th Avenue at that point. So development is starting. You can see some development in here. But the point is here, this is New York in the 1850s when they were about to start building Central Park. And it's, overall, it's a very green landscape still. And this is what that site looked like, the common lands. It wasn't like Jones's Woods. Jones's Woods was kind of like more conducive to a park with its views of the river and its trees. It had lots of trees, whereas the common lands was rocky, kind of barren, hardly any trees on the whole site. There were some groves of trees on the northern part of the site, but there were big stretches that are just kind of, it was described as a wasteland. So it wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, and on the face of it wasn't really a great wouldn't seem like a great place to put a park because there wasn't a lot to work with. But that ended up actually being an advantage because, as we'll see, the designers had to kind of bring so much to the site, to invent the site, to remake it. There wasn't a lot to work with in the beginning. So in 1853, the Central Park Act is signed into law, and the state legislature selects the common lands as the site for the park. So Jones's Woods, I had mentioned, was getting tied up in litigation, and it was proving to be difficult to clear the title. And hold on a second, I have to tell my kids to be quiet. No, it's too noisy. Sorry, guys. So the legislature selects the common lands as the site, 1853. And then 4 years later, the legislature forms the so-called Central Park Commission. It has 11 members. Needless to say, they're all men. No women in any positions of governmental power at this point at all. And so the commission is led by a guy named Andrew Haswell Green. So he's a really important person in the history of New York City, just because his career was so long and varied, and he did so much for the built environment. He's often kind of overlooked in the history of the city. He was kind of like the 19th century version of Robert Moses. Moses was the 20th century version of Green, really. Somebody who made kind of big gestures to redesign the city. But he's often overlooked. And I have a friend who was the former Mike Mischione, who was the former Manhattan borough historian, and he's obsessed with Green. He feels like he's underappreciated, and he's probably right. But he was the president and the treasurer of the Central Park Commission. The treasurer was the key position because he controlled the budget for the park. And then after the park, just skipping ahead for a second, after Central Park was built, the Central Park Commission continued, and Green turned it into the city's first urban planning authority. We had talked when we were looking at the commissioner's plan that the commissioners stopped at 155th Street. Well, who designed the city north of 155th Street? That was the Central Park Commission, with Green leading the charge. So after the Civil War, 1860s, 70s, 80s, the city north of 155th Street is laid out. And then he also widened Broadway from 59th Street up to 106th Street and planted that planted median up the middle that you see if you're on that part of the street. He established Morningside Park, Inwood Hills Park, I think Riverside Park he had a lot to do with as well. He was one of the people who started the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Natural History Museum. He was just all over the place. And then in the late 19th century, he was the main person who pushed for the consolidation of the boroughs into the greater New York City. So for that reason, he's now often called the father of greater New York. So anyway, going back to 1857, he's put in charge of the Central Park Commissioner. The other key figure here is Egbert Viele, who was named the engineer-in-chief of Central Park for only 2 short years, from 1856 to 58. But he was a surveyor and a topographical engineer, and a very talented one. He went on to a long career in surveying, and I'm showing you here his sanitary and topographical map, which to this day is still used to locate water underneath the street. So engineers still use his map to make sure there's not a swamp or a creek under a building site. So he was very talented, and he had, they go into this in the reading, he had dreams of designing Central Park himself. So he did these surveys of the site, of the common land site. And this is a section from 1857, a cross section from 5th to 8th Avenue. And so if you think back to our very first lecture when we were looking at geology, you should know exactly what's going on here. This is the bedrock of the site. You can see how close to the surface it is at times. He has it mislabeled in this drawing as gneiss, but that's actually schist. And then this debris on top is, he has it labeled drift, but that's basically what we would call glacial till, that loose material on top of the bedrock. But you can see that that middle part of the island is really rocky. And that's actually why the common lands was available to buy in the 1850s, because it wasn't useful as farmland because it was because of the bedrock. And then this is a detail from his survey that he did of the site in 1857. And among the many things that it shows, it shows that people were living in the common lands. It wasn't completely vacant. There's a community that had grown up just to the west of the reservoir, which is right here. So right in here, you can see, and then here's a detail, blowing it up slightly. You can see that there are houses there. And there were churches, there was at least one church and at least one school. And this was called Seneca Village. And it was predominantly a Black community, but there were also Irish immigrants that lived there too, and other immigrants. It was kind of just a kind of an ad hoc community that had grown up organically in the common lands because no one else wanted to live there. And for a long time, no one bothered them because nobody cared about the land. And when they decided to build Central Park there, the people who lived in Seneca Village were forced out. They didn't have any choice in staying there because they didn't own the land. They were just squatting. So, it was characterized as, you know, it was just kind of just almost like we would characterize a homeless encampment or something today, something that where people don't have rights, it's temporary and you can move them out. But that's how it was characterized at the time and justified. But you can tell even just from this drawing that it was actually a pretty cohesive plan. I mean, they were continuing these streets through the commissioner's planned streets, right through their community. They weren't paved, but still there was a logic to it, right? And then the houses are arranged along these streets. So, you know, it was, you can see it here in the detail really clearly. It was a very coherent community. But since they didn't own the land, they had no legal right to be there, and they were just forced out, and the Seneca Village was demolished. The reading doesn't go into, I think it might mention this briefly, but it doesn't really go into it in a lot of detail. This is a photograph of what it looked like. You know, these are not mansions, certainly. They're kind of thrown together houses, but they're houses. They had a church, they had a school, people lived there. It was a community. So, I mean, that's one of the ironies, right, of Central Park. Maybe the big irony is that it was intended for public use, a place where everybody can come, regardless of race, regardless of economic situation. And it was designed by abolitionists. Olmsted, who we'll meet in a second, was a passionate abolitionist. These are the years leading up to the Civil War. It was democratic initiative. Let's preserve this land for everyone's use. The irony is that in doing that, they destroyed people's lives and moved them out off with no compensation at all. So that's the big irony of Central Park, right? And then Seneca Village disappears. And for years it was forgotten. Only recently has it really kind of been restored to the history of New York City. And there was an excellent exhibition at City College and Cone Library about it. And there have been excavations and archaeological digs and a lot of writing about it. So over the last like 10 years, Seneca Village has finally been kind of restored to our history. So in 1856, Viely submits his own design for Central Park because that was his dream. He had done all the surveys, but he wanted to be the designer. And his design is not really that great. It's not very imaginative. And so it's rejected. And you can see how angry he is about it. And so he's fired in a couple years later. And so Viely's plan is rejected, and Calvert Vaux, who had been working, you'll remember, was Downing's erstwhile partner. So he had come over, what, 7 or 8 years earlier. And he was so disgusted with Viely's plan that he starts pushing behind the scenes for an open design competition to decide who should design the park. So he says, being thoroughly disgusted with the defects of Viely's plan, I pointed out whenever I had the chance that it would be a disgrace to the city and to the memory of Mr. Downing to have this plan carried out. So he sabotaged Viely behind his back. And so that he could enter his own design in a so-called open design competition, and that's what happens in 1858. So a design competition is still to this day a kind of typical way of deciding on the design of a big scale project, because if you're building something like a park or a stadium or a convention center or something, it behooves you to get a lot of ideas basically for free, and then you pay some prize money and you have a lot of options. So that's what they did here. You can see they shelled out some prize money for the first, second, third, and fourth places. That was quite a bit of money at that point. And this attracted 33 entries for the competition. So 32 of the entries were by men or teams comprised of men. Interestingly, one of the entrants was a woman, Susan Delafield Parrish. Now, I don't know anything about her beyond her name, but I keep meaning to try to look up census records or something and try to figure out who she was, because I'm interested in somebody who would be brave enough to enter a design competition that is where she knows everyone deciding is going to be a man. The 11-person Central Park Commission was all men. And at a time when there were no women in the design professions at all, or engineering. So I'm really curious about her, like how brave could somebody be to do this? The scheme that she came up with has not survived. So we don't really know anything about it beyond a written description. So I think that's interesting. So all men, but one woman and entrant. The first prize was $2,000, and that with inflation is about $55,000 today. So it was pretty substantial. And there were requirements of each of the entries. So, and they go into this in some detail in the reading about like the color and the things that the size of the boards and things like that they had to include. They did have a program for the park, and every entrant had to accommodate the program. So I think that's interesting. So everybody had to have at least 4 cross streets going east-west, of course, to be able to get from one side of the park to the other. It was unrealistic to think that people would go around that entire park. They had to have, things that we take for granted today in parks, but at the time were still kind of a novelty, like fountains. The Croton Aqueduct wasn't that old at this point. They wanted to have towers, so that these majestic towers, which did end up getting built. One of them got built, which is Belvedere Castle in Central Park. And then typical things like flower gardens and playgrounds. They had to include a site for a future museum, which ended up becoming the Met, skating pond, observatory, etc. So everybody had to include those. So Vaux is the one who pushes for the design competition, and then he approaches Frederick Law Olmsted on the right there, who at the time was the superintendent of Central Park. So he had access to all the surveys and knew the site really well, even though he had no experience as a designer. So Vaux asks Olmsted because Olmsted was in that position, which would have been an advantage in the competition. Vaux was the architect. Olmsted was not a designer at this point. He was a wealthy farmer and a writer. He was an abolitionist who had written a couple books about that had been really well received. The most popular at the time was called A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, which was an account of his journey through Texas before the Civil War, where he writes about the horrible conditions of the enslaved people down there. He was really wealthy, and in my opinion, he was an ironic figure, because he was the person who became like the great American landscape architect who is promoting these ideas of democracy and public space, a great abolitionist, but at the same time, really bigoted against immigrants. And I've read some of the things that he wrote at the time about immigrants, which is just absolutely appalling, especially his opinions of Irish and German immigrants. So again, it's kind of ironic that he's revered as this democratic figure. So he wasn't a designer, Olmsted, but he was a farmer, and he knew something about gardening. And he had been to Europe, and he'd seen these great parks over there. He read about it. So he had opinions, even though he had never drawn anything in his life. He kind of knew theoretically what he wanted to do, and he had been heavily influenced, as many people were, by the 18th century English landscape gardener Capability Brown, who was incredibly prolific and designed over 170 gardens. This is one of his typical, one of his most famous gardens here in England, where this is kind of like a typical Capability Brown scene, where you understand a garden in perspective, where you have something in the foreground, in this case a bridge, and then this little kind of neoclassical building in the background, and trees and lakes. And he would arrange these scenes so that you would, as you walk through a landscape, they kind of unfold one after the other. So the complete opposite of the rational logic of the commissioner's plans say, where it makes sense from up above, but the ground level isn't really considered. Capability Brown was the opposite of that, and that was very attractive to Olmsted and to Vaux. And Olmsted had visited Phoenix Park in Dublin, which was an 18th century park, which was way bigger than what Central Park ended up being. It was twice as big as Central Park. And Olmsted said he thought this was the best public park in the world. And I would agree with him. That is all my personal opinion too. It's just a majestic park. It has a little bit of everything. It has formal parts. It has really untended, unlandscaped parts. It has woods, it has field. It's really an incredible park. So Phoenix Park and I think Birkenhead Park and Liverpool were kind of the two big influences on Central Park. So the philosophy behind Central Park, behind Vaux and Olmsted's scheme, is important to talk about a little bit because it was at such odds with the commissioner's plan. So this was a park that was inserted into the commissioner's plan that replaced a big part of the commissioner's plan. And it was coming from philosophically from a completely different place than the commissioner's plan. The commissioner's plan, as you know, from reading what the commissioners wrote about it to justify it, and especially how John Randall talked about it, the commissioner's plan was rational. It was based on precise arithmetic. It was symmetrical. Everything lined up. He tells you exactly how things line up down to the last inch for paragraph after paragraph. 20 city blocks equals a mile. It was like a big equation, you know, that's how Randall talks about it. And it had no hierarchy, aside from the parade, which was never built in the first place. So the commissioner's plan, it's rational, it's symmetrical, it's mathematical. All of that came out of the 18th century Enlightenment, right? So this philosophical movement that is talking about science, talking about rationality, talking about logic, right? So the great like Enlightenment philosopher was Rousseau, who was talking, and Descartes, you know. So if the commissioner's plan was about the Enlightenment of the 18th century and, you know, bleeding over into the 19th century, there's another movement that starts in the 18th century, which is Romanticism, which is completely doing something completely different. And Romanticism is about embracing ambiguity, about imprecision, about mystery even. And this is not just in park design, of course, but it's in literature, it's in poetry, it's in painting. There's the great British painter, J.M.W. Turner, who painted these really moody landscapes with thunderstorms and shipwrecks and things like that. This is one of his paintings here from 1794 of Tintern Abbey. And what he's doing here is showing not like the logic of a cathedral, of an abbey, a monastery, of a church. He's not showing you how precisely it was built. Like John Randall, if he painted this church, would do it in a completely different way. He would measure it and tell you what measurements were. But Turner is describing it as a ruin. He's describing it in perspective as something that kind of unfolds from you as a scene. If you look carefully, you can see the mountains beyond the church. It's got trees and shrubbery growing out of the ruins. It's got pieces on the ground. So this is all about kind of like the romance of the ruin, you know? So that was kind of a theme, the mystery and romance of ruins. And in Romantic literature, it was often like a mystery, or like ghost stories were big in Romantic literature. Castles, fog, things like that. So when it came to landscape design, Capability Brown was totally a Romantic designer. So he was setting up scenes just like what Turner was painting. He was actually setting them up in real life, where he's setting up a bridge in the foreground, a little building in the background, a lake between. So the whole idea of in Romantic gardening and Romantic landscape design was that you're setting scenes. So the idea of scenery kind of becomes a thing for the first time. And it's beautiful, but it's beautiful in a particular way, which is it's subliminal, meaning, the sublime, which is like something is beautiful because of its grandeur, or its ruined quality. Something is subliminal. It's the beauty is kind of coming from like its awesomeness, like something is like a mountain would be sublime. And it's embracing perspective. As a designer, they're embracing perspective. So Vaux and Olmsted were designing primarily in perspective, which is the opposite of John Randall, right? John Randall would never design anything in perspective. He would think, but how do I measure it if it's in perspective? Because things are smaller in the background. How do I measure that? That doesn't make any sense. And Randall would have hated Central Park because it was ambiguous, as we'll see. It's paths wind, paths dead end. Why would you do that? Doesn't make any sense. So they were romantic designers, but it was a particular kind of romanticism that was taking hold in the early to mid 19th century, which is the picturesque style. And it's basically, all that means is that it's a real place that when you stand and you look at it, when you move through it, it's like you're moving through a picture. It's like you're moving through a picture frame. That's what Capability Brown did, and that's what Vaux and Olmsted ended up doing with Central Park. So the site of the Common Lands was 840 acres. And the boundaries I've sketched here on the Commissioner's Plan were between Fifth Avenue on the east and 8th Avenue on the west, and went eventually from 59th Street all the way up to 110th Street. Originally, they were going to stop at 106th, and they explain why they extended it in the reading. It involved rock outcroppings. So I think you probably know what Vaux and Olmsted thought of Randall's plan, right? They hated it. They absolutely hated it. And Olmsted, this is what he writes: some 2,000 blocks were provided, each theoretically 200 feet wide, no more, no less. And ever since, if a building site is wanted, whether with a view to a church or a blast furnace, an opera house or a toy shop, there is, of intention, no better a place in one of these blocks than in another. So what he's criticizing here is the uniformity of the Commissioner's Plan, which is the very thing that John Randall thought was great about it. The efficiency, the convenience, the uniformity, Olmsted hates. And he says that there's no difference between a site for a church and a toy shop, an opera house and a blast furnace. It's homogeneous, it's all the same. And what he wants is a sense of hierarchy in the city, which is what Central Park finally gives to the city, in his opinion. In my opinion, it's still, despite the grid, there's an enormous hierarchy in the city. I mean, a vacant lot that has a little row house in it, it may be on a similar avenue as St. Patrick's Cathedral, but clearly there's a big difference between St. Patrick's Cathedral and a little row house. So somehow, through all the building that happened over the last couple hundred years, the Commissioner's Plan has become varied. But Olmsted is right in that their intention was that things would not be varied, that things would be the same, and that's what he didn't like about it. No surprise, Vaux and Olmsted win the design competition, because Vaux was the one who wanted it in the first place, and Olmsted was the park superintendent. So of course they were going to win the design competition. They were totally in. So not a surprise and probably not a fair competition. However, and thank God, their entry was without a doubt the best one. So we got lucky in that regard. But politically speaking, there was definitely some chicanery going on there. This is their original plan, which we still have. We still have most of their original drawings. And the scale was 100 feet equals an inch, which means these were big drawings. This plan was over 10 feet long. Can you imagine doing a drawing? It's 10 feet long. That's a big drawing. They called their design greensward. Sward meaning like a piece of nature, like a meadow or a scene, you know, sward, so greensward. And this image is divided into two pieces, and that's convenient because they conceived of their design as two sections, a southern section and a northern section. The southern part of it, with the reservoir right at the dividing line, had most of those programmatic requirements that they had to include, the flower gardens, the playgrounds, stuff like that. So it was kind of more designed with a heavier hand, I guess. Whereas the northern part, they had to accommodate the site for the new reservoir, which ends up getting built here. So they didn't have as much room to work with. And also the topography here was more hilly and rougher, and there were more trees in the northern part. So they did a lot to it, but they didn't have to completely invent it the way they did in the southern half. So comparatively speaking, none of it's wild, but the northern part looks more wild. It's kind of, they had a lighter touch with the northern part. And you can see that if you go there today. Most of the people are in the southern part. That's most of the well-known places like Belvedere Castle and the boat pond and the zoo and all that stuff is in the southern part. The northern part, fewer people have ever even been to, and there are places you can hike and really feel like you're out of the city. The receiving reservoir, by the way, was here. But then they built a new reservoir later. So the original reservoir was covered up, and that's today's Great Lawn. So here's a look at the southern half. And one of the things they did that was really ingenious was they had to put roads across the park, but they submerged them. So you go underneath these paths if you're going from one side of the city to the other. And, you know, there are roads and there's traffic, and today there are, you know, taxi cabs and stuff, but it's okay because if you're walking along one of these paths, you just kind of walk over a bridge and you barely notice that the roads are there. So that was a really good idea. And then they also included this promenade here, which was called the Mall, which was kind of the one moment of symmetry in their whole plan. And then lakes here, there's like a lake here and a lake here that they created. Those weren't there. And then here's the comparatively wild northern half. So how to draw a 10-foot long drawing by a deadline? Well, they had some help. So they worked in Vaux's house on 18th Street. And this is a quote that's in the reading from Vaux's son, Downing. Oh, it's so touching, he named his son after Downing. Downing Vaux remembered that there was a great deal of grass to be put in by the usual dots and dashes, and it became the friendly thing for callers to help in the work by joining in and adding some grass to Central Park. So one can imagine that Vaux and Olmsted are working during the day, and so are working at night. So Vaux goes home, and Olmsted comes over in the evening. They smoke a few cigars, and then somebody comes by, and they're like, "Oh, great! Can you stay a while and help us draw grass on this 10-foot long drawing?" That's kind of, I imagine them kind of working with friends into the wee hours and doing some all-nighters to get these huge drawings done. Don't leave yet. You haven't drawn grass yet. You must draw grass. They included also these photographs by the great 19th century photographer Matthew Brady, who later became famous for his Civil War photographs. And they did something that was really smart, which they included like before and after images. So this is showing what the common lands looked like. I mean, it really is a kind of barren wasteland. And then they showed what they're going to do to it. So from this to this. So they've created an entire lake, they've planted trees, and they've made it look really nice. So from this to this. And then here they included sketches of the existing topography, and then what they're going to make out of it. Again, existing, and then the future. So to do this, to pull this off, they had to bring in thousands of trees. There were very few trees on the site, except in the northern part. So they had to bring in thousands of them. There are drainage pipes underneath, over 100,000 feet of drainage pipes underneath the site. They created entire lakes, and they moved earth around. Capability Brown was famous for moving earth around. Like, let's put that forest over here. Let's move that hill over here. And they adopted the same kind of drastic method. Let's move earth, right? So you can see here, this was before steam shovels and backhoes and things like that. So it was all done by hand, pick and shovels, and loading up a cart and having mules or horses take it away. And it was fortunate. Mid-19th century, there are thousands of immigrants arriving in the city every week, willing to do anything. So you want me to dig in Central Park? Great, I have a job, that's fantastic. So a lot of the laborers were Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and they would live around the site. They would build little shanty towns around the site and work there. The park had a huge labor force, thousands of people. So with all of this moving and manipulating of the landscape, the question is, my question to you is it real or not? Is this authentic or is it artificial? It's kind of an open-ended question, because they were out to simulate the country and the city, this idea of rus and urb, and they dug up stuff and flooded areas and drained other areas to create these romantic, picturesque scenes. So is it real or not? I mean, it's up for you. It's for you to decide. It's pretty convincing when you go there and you kind of, until you see a skyscraper beyond a tree, it's pretty convincing. I saw an interview recently with the climber Alex Honnold. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He has climbed all the big walls in Yosemite National Park in California. And it was an interview where he was talking to a climber from New York, and she said, "Oh, yeah, I go climbing in New York. I go in Central Park. There's great places to climb." And he just kind of laughed and he said, "Central Park, that's not outdoors." So it's like, so that's what some people think of it. They still think of, even though it's a big piece of the city, it's still the city. It's not actually even the outdoors. But I mean, for me, it's convincing. When I go there, I can, for a while, for an hour or two, I can forget that I'm in the city, you know?
Professor, question,
Yeah, go ahead.
because I haven't been to Central Park yet. Is it at all possible, once you're in the park, to not be subject to the city noise of vehicles and stuff like that?
In parts of it, yeah, and in parts of it, no. When you cross over those roads that go through it, you definitely hear the traffic noise. And if you get too close to the edge of the park, you hear the traffic noise again. You'll hear honking taxi cabs and stuff like that. But especially in the northern part, if you get off on a hike somewhere, it's really, really quiet. And there's, it's famous for its bird watching, and it's pretty, you can tune out the noise. That's neat that you haven't been, and that'll be something you'll have to do when you
Definitely,
get here.
hopefully at some point this summer, if we get let out.
Yeah. For me, the great thing about Central Park is that they did make it a good size. It is big enough that you can get lost in it. And I've lived here, 20 years, and I still have never, there are parts of it I've never been to. It's just so big. You certainly can't experience it in a day. That's impossible. it would be nice if it was a little bit wider. Sometimes I feel like it's a little too narrow, but let's see, I think I'm almost done and then we'll take a break. So the construction takes forever. I mean, it was a massive project, but they start off with a flurry in 1858 and they finished the first section in only a year. The lower part is done, no doubt because they had the money at that point and they had all of these immigrants ready to lend a hand with a shovel and a pick. So they kind of come out of the gate, but then the Civil War happens. And this delays construction. Construction basically stops during the Civil War, as you can imagine. And Olmsted doesn't fight in the Civil War, but he becomes the head of the Sanitary Commission, which was the government organization that was helping fight disease in the battlegrounds and soldier encampments and trying to advocate for cleaner conditions among the soldiers. So Olmsted goes off and does that, has a nervous breakdown. Vaux has to convince him to come back to the city, and eventually they start working on it again because they didn't just design it, but they're also overseeing the construction. And they don't actually, the park is not actually finished until 1876. So it takes a long time to finish. So again, two reasons. It was a huge project, first of all, and the Civil War was right in the middle of it. So that slowed things down. So it opens in 1876 and then it's, everything that they imagined it would be, instant success, and is still there. And it's been restored over the last 30 years. So it's more in line with the original vision of the park than it was, say, 50, 60 years ago. Some of the stuff that you see there now, like the baseball fields, were not original. Those were added in the Robert Moses era, mid 20th century. And I don't know how Vaux and Olmsted would have felt about all the baseball fields and stuff like that, but I mean, I think it's cool. It's big enough that you can have them. What's wrong with baseball, Okay, I think that's all I got for you today. Yes, it is. Okay, so we're gonna take a break. Let's take 20 minutes and then let's meet back here at
Quick question,
1:30.
Professor.
Hold on one second. Let's meet back here at 1:30. And then I want to talk a little bit about the exam, which I'm going to send you this afternoon. So we'll talk about that. Yes, Xavier?
Is there an entrance fee for Central Park?
No.
So how do they keep track of the numbers going in and out? Because I saw a statistic with it in 2019 being the most visited park in the US.
I have no idea how they would keep track of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I just found it interesting because I never heard of a fee associated with the park, but because of that statistic, I started wondering, well, how do these people keep track of those numbers?
Yeah, it's a good question. How would they keep track if you go into the park and you leave and no one knows that you're there? So how would they know?
I have no clue.
Unless they're keeping track in some suspicious, creepy way. That's weird. I don't know. There must be some, I don't know, I'm not good at statistics. There must be some way of predicting how many people are there in a certain day. Wow. I don't know.
I didn't read too much into the statistics, but I just saw it and thought it was interesting.
There's like a concert or something or a protest, and then you read the next day that police estimate there were 50,000 people there. How do they know, really? So I'm dubious about those numbers, but certainly if you go there on a nice summer day, it is crazy crowded, Central Park. It's unbelievably crowded. Sometimes it's like Midtown Manhattan. It's like, why am I even trying to be in a park? I might as well be on a crowded sidewalk. But other days you go there and there's nobody there, which is great. Okay,
Thanks.
I will see you guys in about 15 minutes.
Oops.